Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. I'd like to thank Adrienne Ghali for so kindly chairing this panel. It's wonderful to have her and her expertise here. Also, Margaret, thank you for that marvelous talk and for coming all the way from California to lend your expertise. Really grateful. And Brian, it's just wonderful to have you. Your work I've admired so much over the years, and I've enjoyed teaching and coming all the way from Bryan Hall to here to be with us. Also wanted to thank again Matt Martello, who's been doing such a great job the last 4 years or so as assistant director of the Center for Poetry and Poetics. Also thank my students especially for being here and putting up with another bit of Ramazani speak. So the center's been going on for 8 years, and this is the first time that I've been invited to give a talk, and the director asked me if I'd like to give a talk, and I said, well, isn't that a little awkward? Do you think that's a good idea? And he said, well, why not? I hear that you're working on this kind of thing, and you haven't given a talk, for all these years, and I hear you've, gathered some poems from the Norton Anthology of English Literature in this area, and have an essay coming out. And I said, well, but still, doesn't it seem a little presumptuous? But he was really insistent and finally said, look, you're a cheap date. You and Brian, I don't have to pay your airfare, your hotel, anything like that. It's just like when Rita Dove was the first poet we, had speak. It's cost-free. So, you can question the wisdom of the director, who will go nameless in making that choice. But here goes. Okay, turn this off. So, climate grief, which I want to talk about today, poses obvious difficulties, challenges to the standard model of elegy, the genre of poetry of mourning for the dead. These challenges include scale, grieving not only individual losses, but also the precarity, dying, and possible death of the planet, and temporality and subject matter, not only retrospective, but also anticipatory mourning for the slow, uneven, and uncertain climate-induced dying of human and other species. But given that 21st century climate poems, by these and many other poets, echo recognizable features of elegy, are there ways of conceiving these poems as elegies for the planet that clarify their ethical purchase, elucidate their literary power, and embrace their necessity? And what are the implications of this body of work for conceptualizing our affective responses to the climate crisis? Well, since the start of the 21st century, when the third report, 2011 of the IPCC established a scientific consensus around human-caused global warming, poets have been grappling extensively with the threat to the planet. Although the reckoning with, and although of course this goes back, as we've heard, in some ways to Clare, to poems like Byron's Darkness, and so forth, so there are obviously precursors to this. Although the reckoning with grief over climate change in the media and politics has fallen well short, in the words of Ashley Consolo, of the lived experiences of many people around the globe, the rise of climate poetry's sponsorships, such as these by Lloyd's of London and a Royal Society, indicate a public interest in poetry as a cultural space for responding to, reflecting on, and mourning world-scale losses. So too did The Guardian's publication in 2015 of 20 climate poems created by Carol Ann Duffy, then Britain's poet laureate, poems lamenting the anthropogenic changes resulting in the sickening and prospective death of the planet, ice melt, atmospheric warming, floods and fires and droughts, human and species displacement, and possible extinction. These and many other recent poems invoke and aggressively remake strategies of elegy: ritualistic repetition, apostrophe to the dead, satire of the degraded present, lament of a golden past, the search for solace in a personified nature. Putting in relief what Judith Butler calls the tie between mourner and mourned, the I and the you, a poem written before the turn of millennium, W.S. Merwin's eco-elegy for a coming extinction, deploys and suspends elegiac apostrophe in a mock address to the possibly doomed gray whale. I write as though you could understand, and I could say, one must always pretend something among the dying. This is a shot. I actually got a whale off the Jersey coast a few years ago, a related whale. More recently, Pascal Petit's Rainforest in the Sleep Room, grieving biodiversity loss, dramatically renews elegiac personification of the natural world by representing human intrusion into the Amazon rainforest as a lobotomy. The highway goes through the Amazon's brain like an ice pick through an eye socket. And she goes on in this personifying mode. By the way, I offer, of course, in the longer version of this, much more extensive readings of each of these poems. You get the movie trailer version this time, just little bits. Of course, and the secondary thoughts are today. The much better thoughts are in these. Anyway, despite these and many other examples, prominent eco-critics have raised questions about whether elegy is suited to ecological grief, preeminently Timothy Morton. Ecological poetry must thus transcend the elegiac mode, asserts Morton, whose rich, complex arguments against elegy's hypostatizing of nature as the ultimate lost object, its treatment of nature as a sounding board for human grief, as well as like-minded critiques by others, are worth teasing out in this talk in my short time today, which is structured like this. I'm going to go quickly to part one. Because Morton and other critics raise concerns about the temporal dynamics of elegy. Regarding the past, Timothy Clark worries that an environmental response inculcating a sense of loss promotes over-idealizing images of the natural and an idealizing nostalgia. Elegy is said to freeze nature as unchangeable, despite the long history and now accelerated pace of climatic shifts. It indulges what Renato Rosaldo terms imperialist nostalgia. A person kills somebody and then mourns the victim. For Elizabeth de Lockery, who quotes Rosaldo, such yearning in elegy risks obfuscating the mourner's complicity in the destruction of what's mourned. But climate elegies suggest other possibilities. In her punningly entitled Eco-to-nomics, Patience Agbabi, building on found poetry from The Guardian of Nepalese villagers' reported similes, these are in italics on the left-hand side from this snippet from The Guardian, compares her plane's flight, as she's reading this news article, to the flooding waves that it and other such fossil fuel burning technologies are causing, particularly in the global south. Then all the land started moving like a river. 10,000 meters above sea level, the plain heaves like a tidal wave. Short, easily transmitted, fired in the mind, most lyrics leave an insignificant carbon footprint. But like Agbabi's poem, Seamus Heaney's Huffen also features a lyric speaker who knows his air flight is implicated in the global destruction mourned by the poem, written after a small plane bore him over the Vatna Glacier, the largest ice cap in Iceland. The 3-ton glacier has begun to melt. What will we do, they ask, when boulder melt comes wallowing across the delta flats and the miles-deep shag ice makes its move? Both literalizing and mythologizing the glacier as an enormous beast with multiple tongues, playing, of course, on the term for glacial extensions, Heaney ponders humanity's precarious fate in the face of the melting he and others have caused, a melt sonically enacted by the pararhyme of begun to melt with bolder melt. The multiple compounds also suggest Old English and Old Norse kennings, words bolted together in an ancient frozen world that now threatens to come undone as the undead glacier melts, just as the compounds later disappeared from the poem. I saw it ridged and rock-set from above, undead, gray-gristed earth pelt, eon scruff. Far from belonging to a static, idealized past, the glacier is the result of an age-old process of grinding or gnashing together of cold air, rock, and ice, as accentuated by the alliterative compound gray-gristed. With its 3 melting tongues, a slumbering giant, this is the end of the poem, hurt, ruffled, awoken by our careless abuses, threatens to stop even this poet's solitary tongue and its warm, mouth-watering words of mouth. Part 2. If Eco-Elegies' retrospective cast is said to be obfuscatory, the same is no less true in the eyes of some of its orientation toward the future. Jennifer Wenzel and Amitav Ghosh worry, for example, that an imagined eco-apocalypse distracts attention from the present. But as evidenced by poems such as those by Agbabi and Heaney and others that we just looked at, climate elegy acknowledges the future as now. The present tense propensity of lyric, see Jonathan Culler on that from his book Theory of the Lyric, crucial to many of these poems, vividly enacts the existential immediacy of the climate crisis. In her planetary elegies, Joy Graham supercharges the present-focused, future-haunted carpe diem topos. Represent me, says the day. Quick, there's no time to lose. Represent my million odors. Represent my shaking grasses. She often mourns the now from the perspective of an apocalyptic future, uncertain as in Dawn 2040, which actually on the phone yesterday she agreed that she might be willing to read for us later this afternoon, so stay tuned. If we survive at the end of this story, in a time of rapid climate change, the just now and just gone are so entangled that she announces in the same poem, I give up on tenses here. Unbound by the linear representational demands of novelistic realism, climate poetry can more easily evince the enmeshed tenses of the Anthropocene. But for Morton, ecological elegy weeps for that which will have passed, a, quote, future perfect that hollows out time. We look back upon ourselves from the vantage point of the imagined future perfect, a future anterior. Prone to ecological apocalypticism, not the easiest word to say, eco-elegy symbolically kills nature for a second time, he says, before it has fully happened for the first time. Now, in my view, poets are often attuned to this danger, what I term the economic problem of poetic mourning, worrying that to the extent that elegy issues in the work of art, the poets capitalized on, and in that sense perhaps even willed loss for the sake of what Tennyson calls the far-off interest of tears, or making what Derrida calls the unbearable wager to profit or derive some benefit from death. If anticipatory mourning is indecent, as Derrida suggests, yet silence reprehensible, what's a poet to do? In a revision of Adorno's aphorism, nach Auschwitz ein Gedicht zu schreiben ist barbarisch, is it barbaric to write poetry before the climate apocalypse? A climate poem such as Ed Roberson's To See the Earth Before the End of the World wrestles with this elegiac conundrum on a massive scale. In the poem, the media unreflectingly capitalize on the will to gawk at climate emergency as if it were a crash scene, a spectatorial greed emphasized by the violent participles grabbing and chasing. Availing itself of poetry's freedom to rapidly traverse temporalities, the poem unsettlingly jumps between long climatic time and our brief human lives, longer than we, between the large and our human extinction. Lyric's been criticized as a vehicle for addressing climate change because its scalar shifts may anticipate and even neutralize the shock of the Anthropocene and thus help make palatable the contradictions of time. But such cross-scalar thinking, as our very own Ian Bauckham suggests, is crucial to engaging the climate crisis. Roberson points up these temporal contradictions in his splintered syntax and abrupt imagistic shifts that don't smooth them out or neutralize them. Humanity's age-old destructive habits, highlighted at the end of this poem, are especially familiar to peoples long on the receiving end of colonization and racial subjugation. Stephanie Lemenager draws on the observation of indigenous philosopher Kyle White that Native Americans have, quote, already endured and lived beyond the end of their world. Like other people who, that is unlike other people, who faced with anthropogenic climate change are only just now learning to die. Similarly, Catherine Yusoff writes that imperialism and ongoing settler colonialisms have been ending worlds for as long as they've been in existence. In Franny Choi's The World Keeps Ending and the World Goes On, peoples at the margins of power have already undergone the apocalyptic ending of their worlds.
Before the apocalypse, there was the apocalypse of boats. Boats of prisoners, boats cracking under sky iron, boats making corpses bloom like algae on the shore. Before the apocalypse, there was the apocalypse of the bombed mosque. There was the apocalypse of the taxi driver warped by flame.
Following the ironic, paradoxical anaphora at the beginning of these phrases, with epistrophe at the end of them, before the apocalypse, there was the apocalypse, a rhetorical structure that embeds recurrent beginnings and endings. Choi lists worlds that have ended for war-driven migrants, victims of mosque bombings, runaway slaves, and native peoples, including victims of Columbus's arrival in the New World, and for a poet of Korean heritage, the brutal 13th century Mongol invasions of the Korean peninsula ruled by Kublai Khan. Also mourned are specifically ecological losses, such as water defiled by pipelines, bees undergoing species collapse, and rain turned radioactive. The argument against ecological apocalypticism forgets that the experience of the loss of the world is uneven, that for some peoples, the future is the past. Part 3. Morton's strongest objection to elegy, echoed by other critics, is that it enacts what Freud represents as a normative process of mourning, which involves a separation of the natural from the human as an object to be, and these are all tropes that he invokes, buried, killed, consumed, swallowed, digested. A Hamlet-like, and this is, of course, Freud's famous distinction here, a Hamlet-like lingering in melancholy would be more appropriate, says Morton, even more scientific, allowing the object to stick in our throats. Morton champions a kind of elegy aligned not with mourning, but with melancholia, lingering in the planetary grief as a protracted, ultimately interminable process. When it comes to mourning the world, in Derrida's words on grief, failure succeeds. Are there elegies for the planet that satisfy these desires for a form of eco-grief that will be self-critical, protracted, unredemptive, ultimately melancholic? Well, in the self-implicating, self-accusing grief over climate change in elegies by Heaney, Bobby, and Juliana Spar, in the voiding of natural sources of solace in Petit, Merwin, Vani, Capildio, and in Graham, Roberson, and Choi, the collapse of temporalities that might have traced an arc toward future redemption. Planetary elegy dismantles various facets of the elegies' consolatory structures. In her marvelous book, Margaret Ronda calls attention to just such a melancholic, self-accusing strand of elegy, as you see in this quote here, and as some of us have been reading this week. Indeed, planetary elegy renounces what Ramazani calls the culture of redemption, which pretends that art's superior patching function can correct existence, including the catastrophes of history. With their candor about elegy's limits, contemporary poets avow that not even the most brilliant and beautiful art could magically make up for the massive losses of anthropogenic climate change, let alone the previous destruction of colonized and racialized people's worlds that led up to it. Rather than conniving in the disastrous view that substitutes can always be found, that damage can always be repaired, a conceptual framework that's propelled humanity and the planet toward the brink of catastrophe, melancholic elegy knows it cannot redeem planetary loss, but it can witness it, mourn it, and reflect on it and our lived and story experience of grief on a global scale. Part 4. Some melancholic climate poems are so zoomed out, miniaturizing time-lapse in history or the future, that they may not seem to grieve planetary loss, but underneath their sometimes chilly, distanced visions of global demise, it isn't hard to detect an underlying grief. Such is Peter Redding's tightly constructed prophetic satire, Clockwise from the Bottom, proceeding clockwise around the globe as the clock counts down. Surveying the future damage if the globe warms 4 degrees Celsius, the poem gives each region its own clipped strophic sentence, such as the sarcastically punning Middle East, same Old Testament, and the bleakly epitaphic Polynesia, sunk. Planetary elegy's radical reimagining of scale to bring massive and long-lived processes within the realm of apprehension comes, of course, out of modernism, such as poems such as Eliot's Wasteland and Wallace Stevens' 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird. In a poem recycling Wallace Stevens' 13 Ways of Looking at a Glacier, Chamorro Pacific Islander poet Craig Santos Perez adapts Stevens' cubistic array of perspectives to defamiliarize an image of climate change so ubiquitous and cliche as to be hard to see. Reversing Stevens, Perez's first poem's number 13, and the sequence apocalyptically counts down to 1. It was summer all winter. It was melting, and it was going to melt. The last glacier fits in our warm hands. As in the self-indictment in Heaney's warm, mouth-watering word of mouth, Perez points to the human hands that have contributed disastrously to glacial melt, up to and including his own hands and ours, making and receiving the poem. There's no overt expression of grief, no flowery hearse here. The pathos of the image of the last glacier, cradled in human hands, is more poignant for being implied rather than stated. To conclude, but is grief the appropriate response to planetary crisis? Does the dispassionate, distanced, often ironic vision of poems by Redding, Perez, and others shrink human agency? Is the melancholic, consolation-resistant grief in eco-elegies defeatist? Shouldn't these poems rally us to fight against self-serving, obtuse climate change denial? To fight for immediately needed political action to mitigate global warming? Well, such questions, which underlie critiques by Tim Clark and several others, assume a dichotomy between eco-lament and environmentalist deed. It seems to me that melancholic grief, far from being passive, has often been an important motivator of political action, as seen in the melancholic stance advocated by the AIDS activist community, the militantly grieving mothers in Argentina and Kosovo, and the liberation struggles ongoing in many parts of the global south. In the imaginative realm, consider Antigone, or her Pacific Islander counterpart, a mythical figure permanently frozen in grief for her sister in a tale that the Marshallese poet-activist Kathy Jetnall-Kirchner invokes in the video poem Rise, 2018, made with another indigenous poet from the opposite side of the world, the Greenlander Aka Niviana, demonstrating the interwoven fate of a melting glacial land and distant islands threatened with inundation, these poets chant,
Sister Isis, no, I come to you now, in grief, mourning landscapes that always forced to change. First, through wars inflicted on us, then the nuclear waste dumped in our waters, on our ice, and now, this.
they demand immediate action, warning,
That these issues will affect each and every one of us. None of us is immune. And that each and every one of us has to decide if we will rise.
So arguably, it seems to me, the lamentation of bioloss is foundational to climate action. In short, we need poets who raise ecological laments on various timbres. Highway goes through the Amazon's brain like an ice pick through an eye socket. The plain heaves like a tidal wave. The 3-ton glacier has begun to melt. Represent my shaking grasses. People are grabbing at the chance to see. Before the apocalypse, there was the apocalypse. Polynesia sunk. It was summer all winter. It was melting, and it was going to melt. Instead of transcending the elegiac mode, climate elegy expands and enriches the language, variety, and imaginative complexity of responses to the magnitude and pain of ecological devastation, past and passing and to come. Thank you.